Okay, let's start. Number 10. The coca leaf of the Inca. A child was given a drink, positioned upright against a mountain shrine, and left in the cold until it took her into a permanent conversation with the gods. When archaeologists found her, the evidence was still in her mouth, a wad of chewed coca leaf, wedged between cheek and teeth, still undissolved after 500 years of ice. The Inca called this rite capacocha. The children chosen for it were often selected for their physical perfection, then walked hundreds of kilometers along the road system linking Cusco to the empire's mountain shrines, given coca and maize beer in growing amounts as the journey neared its end. The Andes' highest peaks were considered huacas, sacred places where the line between the living and the ancestors grew thin. A child sent up to a summit shrine wasn't dead the way someone dies down in a valley. In Inca cosmology, that child had been relocated, sent to sit among the ancestors and go on speaking for the community below. Spanish chroniclers writing after the conquest, Juan de Betanzos among them, recorded that these ceremonies tended to coincide with major events in the empire: a coronation, a victory in battle, a disaster the state needed to explain by appealing straight to the ancestors. Johann Reinhard, working alongside Peruvian archaeologist José Antonio Chávez, recovered 3 Capacocha mummies from the summit of Uyailco in Argentina in 1999, at 6,739 meters. Andrew Wilson at the University of Bradford later analyzed hair samples from the mummies for a 2013 paper in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences and found a measurable rise in coca and alcohol consumption over the final months and weeks of life, sharpest in the last few days. Coca wasn't there just to numb the cold. Its alkaloids suppress appetite, dull sensation, and bring on a state of calm alertness. And combined with the hypothermia already setting in at that altitude, the chewed leaf eased a child into a state the Inca didn't classify as dying. They classified it as arrival. Wilson's data also showed that the rise wasn't abrupt. It built gradually over roughly a year, which points to slow ritual preparation rather than one drugged moment at the summit. Reinhardt's team found the Uyailco maiden seated cross-legged, hands folded in her lap, wrapped in cochineal red textiles, her braided hair intact after 5 centuries, preserved by the same cold that ended her life. None of the mummies were treated as corpses afterward. Andean communities kept returning to these shrines for generations, leaving offerings, treating the summit less like a sealed grave and more like an address you could still reach. The coca quid found in the Uyailco maiden's mouth had been there when she died. She'd been chewing at the exact moment consciousness left her. She hadn't stopped communicating. She'd simply changed to which world she spoke from. About 8 million people across the Andes still chew coca today, mostly for the lift it gives and the way it eases high-altitude breathing, with almost none of the funerary weight it carried 500 years ago. The same leaf that eased the child toward the ancestors now sits in market stalls in La Paz, next to bags of quinoa. The ritual disappeared. The plant is still right there. The Inca sent their dead upward into the cold to keep them talking from the peaks. 2,000 kilometers north, in the swamps of the Maya lowlands, a different culture found the quicker route into the same conversation, and it didn't need a mountain at all. Number 9. Tobacco enemas of the Maya. On a classic Maya vase, a painted scene shows one figure pressing a rubber bulb syringe into another, not into the mouth. This is an enema, and what's being delivered is tobacco, concentrated enough to bring on visions within minutes. Those visions didn't arrive through smoke or chewing or snuff. They arrived through an enema bulb, at a dose strong enough to make an ordinary smoker throw up before anything else happened. Maya elites and ritual specialists took tobacco, coots in Yucatec Maya, in several ways: smoked, snuffed, or chewed with lime to release its alkaloids faster. The enema route, shown on painted ceramics from the classic period, roughly 250 to 900 CE, sent the drug straight into the bloodstream through the rectal membrane, skipping the digestive system and the vomiting that heavy doses of smoked or swallowed tobacco almost always cause. Nicotina rustica, the species most often used in these rituals, carries nicotine levels several times higher than the tobacco grown for cigarettes today. At ritual doses, nicotine poisoning doesn't feel like a stimulant buzz. It brings cold sweats, muscle tremors, and hallucinations vivid enough to frighten, a state Maya elites seem to have chased on purpose rather than stumbled into by accident. Fieldwork among indigenous groups in South America who still use concentrated tobacco preparations, including research from anthropologist Johannes Wilbert, backs this up. Experienced practitioners describe the state as a controlled crossing, not an overdose that got out of hand. Francis Robesek, an art historian who spent the 1970s and 80s cataloging classic Maya ceramic iconography, found enema scenes across dozens of painted vessels, several of them paired with images of ancestral figures and underworld deities. Peter First, an anthropologist focused on Mesoamerican shamanism, tied the practice to the broader Maya cosmology of Xibalba, the underworld the hero twins of the Popol Vuh travel through to confront the lords of death before coming back transformed. The enema route wasn't only about avoiding vomiting either. It was fast. Smoked tobacco takes minutes to build to threshold. An enema can hit full effect almost instantly, which mattered in a ritual performed in front of an audience. By every ethnographic account of similar practices still in use, the visions at these doses were rough and disorienting. Nausea, tremor, and a feeling of the body coming apart came first. Maya specialists read that price as the price of admission to Xibalba. The body had to be pushed to its limit before the mind could go where the ancestors were. Robesek's catalog shows the enema administered in enclosed ritual spaces, away from public plazas, which suggests this wasn't performed as a public spectacle, but reserved for a small circle of elite practitioners. Nicotine is still the most widely used psychoactive substance on the planet. Over 1 billion people take it daily, and almost none of them are chasing an underworld vision. It's the same compound, whether it's easing a Maya ritual specialist toward contact with the dead or being smoked on someone's lunch break. What changed was the dose. The intent went with it. The Maya pushed the body past its limit to reach the dead. On the California coast, a different plant managed something similar without hurting the body at all. It just took the mind somewhere the body couldn't come along. Number 8. Datura and the Chumash Toloache ritual. Boys as young as 8 were handed a drink capable of killing them, and the ones who made it through came back saying they'd spoken with dead relatives. The Chumash of coastal California called the plant momoy. Botanists call it Datura wrighti. It's one of the most dangerous psychoactive plants in North America, and it was given to children deliberately. The Toloache ceremony, well documented among the Chumash and neighboring groups in Southern California, marked the boy's passage into adulthood. Under a pasak, a specialist trained specifically in preparing datura, boys drank a measured brew made from the plant's root. Datura carries scopolamine and atropine, tropane alkaloids that produce something genuinely different from other hallucinogens. Not colorful visions layered on top of reality, but a total inability to tell the vision apart from the room you're actually standing in. People reported holding conversations with others who weren't physically there, with no way in the moment the conversation wasn't real. That's what sets datura apart from almost everything else on this list. Someone on San Pedro or psilocybin usually still knows, even mid-vision, that they're having one. Someone on a strong dose of datura has no such anchor to hold on to. Thomas Blackburn and Lowell Bean, anthropologists who spent the 1970s working with Chumash oral tradition and ethnohistoric records, described the pasak's role as an exacting one. Dosage was calculated against body weights and prior tolerance because the gap between a visionary dose and a fatal one is thin enough that a miscalculation could kill. John Peabody Harrington, who recorded extensive Chumash ethnography in the early 20th century from elders including Fernando Librado, collected accounts of boys spending days in this state, guided through meetings with dead relatives and animal spirit guardians who'd protect them for the rest of their lives. Nobody treated these visions as symbolic. They were literal meetings, arranged and supervised, with consequences that followed the boy into adult identity and social standing. Once a boy's spirit guardian was revealed during the Dolawacha trance, per Blackburn's reconstruction of Chumash religious life from mission-era testimony, it became a lasting source of power he could call on in later ceremonies. The danger wasn't a flaw to work around, it was the point. A boy who survived Mamoy had proven something no safer rite of passage could prove. He'd gone somewhere no adult could verify and come back visibly changed, more confident, bound to specific spirit guardians, holding new standing among his peers. Datura still grows wild across the American Southwest, and emergency rooms still see teenagers poisoned after brewing it themselves, without a basak's training or the dosage knowledge Chumash specialists spent years mastering. What used to require a supervised multi-day ceremony to survive now shows up mostly as a warning on a poison control hotline. The ritual knowledge took generations to build. It never made the transfer. Only the danger did. The Chumash risked death to speak with the dead. Across the Atlantic, inside Egyptian tombs, a much gentler flower offered nearly the same invitation, minus the risk. Number 7. The Blue Lotus of Egypt. Tomb wall after tomb wall shows a pharaoh holding a blue flower right under his nose. It's not decorating the room, and it's not a gift being offered. It's being inhaled. Deliberately, scene after scene, in depictions of funerary banquets and journeys into the afterlife. Nymphaea caerulea, the Egyptian blue lotus, grew in the shallows of the Nile and shows up in Egyptian funerary art from the Old Kingdom onward, roughly 2600 BCE through the end of the Ptolemaic period. It contains apomorphine and nuciferin, compounds with mild sedative and euphoric effects once concentrated, most effectively by soaking the flower in wine for a while. Egyptologist Lise Manisha, who published extensively on ancient Egyptian pharmacology through the 80s and 90s, tracked the flower's consistent presence in banquet and funerary scenes, often held right to the nose of the deceased or a mourner at the precise moment of ritual passage between life and the underworld. The blue lotus closes at dusk and opens again at dawn, floating just under the surface overnight before rising once more. A small daily disappearance and return that Egyptian religious thought mapped directly to Ra's nightly journey through the underworld and his return each morning. The flower wasn't just something people enjoyed on its own. It shows up specifically at threshold moments, funerary banquets, scenes of resurrection, illustrations tied to spells from the Book of the Dead, meant to guide the deceased through the underworld and back transformed. Egyptian dream incubation temples, where petitioners slept inside sacred grounds, hoping for a divine visit in their sleep, used lotus-infused wine as part of the preparation, according to Herodotus's account of his 5th century BCE visit to Egypt, backed up by temple inscriptions at sites like the sanctuary of Imhotep at Saqqara. The flower didn't create the vision by itself. It lowered the threshold enough that a vision, if one came, had somewhere to land. If you've ever watched a water lily close at dusk and wondered whether it would really open again, you felt, in miniature, the exact anxiety Egyptian funerary art existed to answer. That daily disappearance and return wasn't incidental to why Egyptians chose this particular flower. It was the whole point. A flower that died and came back every single day, stood in for the exact promise every tomb painting made about what happened to the person buried underneath. Nymphaea caerulea is sold today as a relaxation tea and a vape additive marketed for its mild euphoric buzz, with no mention of the 4,000 years it spent as a funerary threshold plant. The chemistry hasn't moved an inch. It's just changed rooms, from the tomb to the wellness aisle. Egypt used a flower that died and came back every single day. Farther north, on Crete, a culture built an entire cult around a plant that did something close to that to the human body itself. Number 6. The poppy goddess of Minoan Crete. A clay figurine stands with her arms raised, 3 slits cut into the crown of her head, each one holding a seed pod carved with careful, deliberate incisions. Those pods aren't ornamental. They're opium poppy capsules, scored the exact way a farmer scores them to release the sap, sitting right on a goddess's head. The figurine, excavated at Gazi on Crete and dated to the late Minoan period, around 1300 BCE, is on display today at the Heraklion Archaeological Museum. Arthur Evans, who led excavations at Knossos in the early 20th century, first drew the connection between Minoan religion and opium use, and later archaeobotanical work confirmed opium pollen and seed remains at several Minoan and Mycenaean sites across Crete and mainland Greece. Base ring juglets made on Cyprus and traded across the eastern Mediterranean during the Late Bronze Age, roughly 1650 to 1050 BCE, are shaped to closely resemble an upside-down opium poppy seed head, a resemblance archaeologist Robert Merrilees first pointed out in a 1962 paper in Antiquity. Residue analysis on sealed examples of these juglets, done by researchers including Andrew Coe at Brandeis University, has turned up traces consistent with opium alkaloids inside vessels that traveled as far as Egypt and the Levant. Opium slows the body and mind, brings on euphoria at moderate doses, and at higher doses produces a trance-like unconsciousness that observers across several Mediterranean cultures linked to a temporary crossing into death. The 3 pods on the Gazi figurine's head, incised to show the sap release cuts, mark her as a figure tied directly to harvesting and administering the drug rather than as passive decoration. Minoan religious practice, pieced together mostly from figurines, seal stones, and fresco imagery, since no Minoan religious texts survive in a form scholars can fully read, appears to have centered heavily on death and rebirth cycles tied to the agricultural seasons. A goddess wearing the incised poppy would have presided over exactly the kind of controlled unconsciousness ritual specialists use to approach the dead without joining them for good. The Gazi figurine stands roughly 77 centimeters tall, arms raised in a gesture archaeologists elsewhere in Minoan art associate with epiphany, the instant a deity becomes visibly present to a worshipper. The trade network built around these Cypriot opium juglets moved the drug across the entire eastern Mediterranean for roughly 6 centuries, reaching Egyptian tombs, Levantine ports, and Mycenaean palace centers on the Greek mainland. A substance tied to a death and rebirth cult on one small island turned into a commodity moving between civilizations that otherwise shared little besides trade routes and war. Shipwreck evidence, including cargo pulled from late Bronze Age wrecks off the Turkish coast, shows these juglets packed in alongside other high-value goods, which tells you the opium inside was worth the cargo space on a ship where every amphora already had a purpose. Opium is still one of the most tightly controlled substances on Earth, the raw material behind both surgical anesthesia and a global addiction crisis that kills tens of thousands of people every year. The same plant incised onto a Bronze Age goddess's head to guide the living toward the dead is now regulated by international treaty. Crete used controlled unconsciousness to visit the dead and come back. In the highlands of Guatemala, a different fungus offered something the Minoans never claimed, not just a visit, but direct speech with the gods who ran death itself. Number 5. The mushroom stones of the Maya highlands. Small stone sculptures, some over 2,000 years old, show a mushroom rising out of a human or animal base, its cap carved with the same care as a temple relief. More than 200 of these have turned up across the Guatemalan highlands and nearby regions. Archaeologists call them mushroom stones. Nobody disputes what they show. What they were really used for took decades to nail down. The stones date mainly to the pre-classic period, roughly 1000 BCE to 250 CE, concentrated in the Guatemalan highlands and parts of neighboring El Salvador and Mexico. R. Gordon Wasson, a banker turned amateur ethnomycologist, traveled to Oaxaca in 1955 and took part in a mushroom ceremony led by Mazatec curandera Maria Sabina, then published an account in Life magazine in 1957, tying contemporary Mexican mushroom rituals to ancient stone carvings sitting in museum collections. Psilocybe mushrooms, the genus behind most of these ceremonial traditions, contain psilocybin, which converts in the body to psilocin and produces intense visual and auditory hallucinations, along with a commonly reported dissolving of the line between self and surroundings. Wasson's original hypothesis ran into heavy pushback from mainstream archaeologists. Several argued the stones were simple fertility symbols with no link to any mushroom ritual, a position that held for years until ethnographic and chemical evidence from living Mazatec practice made the mushroom explanation hard to dismiss. Mazatec ritual practice, documented by Wasson and later by anthropologists including Alvaro Estrada, treated the mushrooms not as a casual drug, but as a way to consult directly with spirits, ancestors, and the dead, guided exclusively by a trained curandera who spoke for the mushroom during the ceremony. Aztec accounts recorded by the Spanish friar Bernardino de Sahagún in the 16th century describe the substance called tionanacat, translated as flesh of the gods, used in funerary and divinatory rituals, matching a mushroom stone tradition that predates the Aztec Empire by well over 1,000 years. Sahagún's informants described visions of dead relatives and journeys to far-off places during the tionanacat ceremonies, language strikingly close to 20th century Mazatec accounts recorded independently 400 years later. What's striking is how far that continuity stretches. A carved stone from 500 BCE and a taped ethnographic interview from 1955 describe functionally the same ritual, the same purpose, and in some cases, the same species of mushroom. Sabina herself told Wasson the mushrooms weren't a drug in the sense he meant. She called them her saint children and described the ceremony as a way of asking them where a missing object, a missing person, or a lost path back to the dead could be found. Psilocybin is now in clinical trials at institutions including Johns Hopkins and Imperial College London, aimed at treating end-of-life anxiety in terminally ill patients, and researchers report that guided sessions often produce experiences patients describe as encounters with dead loved ones. The mushroom carved onto a pre-classic Guatemalan altar to contact the dead is now being given in a hospital setting to people getting ready to become the dead themselves. The Maya reached the dead through a fungus growing wild in their highlands. Across the Atlantic, on the west coast of Central Africa, a different route pushed its initiates much closer to the edge of dying itself. Number 4. Iboga and the Bwiti Death Journey. An initiate is given a dose of root bark large enough to stop most people's hearts, and for the next day and night they aren't expected to move, speak, or eat. What they're expected to do is die. Not literally, ritually, and then come back. Tabernanthe iboga grows in the rainforests of Gabon and nearby parts of Central Africa, and its root bark holds ibogaine, an alkaloid capable of producing hallucinations that stretch on for up to 24 hours at initiatory doses, alongside a real cardiac risk that anthropologists studying the tradition describe as an accepted danger, not an accident anyone's trying to prevent. The Bwiti religious tradition, practiced by the Fang and related ethnic groups and formally recognized as a national religion in Gabon in 1948, builds its initiation ceremony around a massive dose of iboga root bark given over several hours to a first-time initiate. Smaller doses of the same roots show up in everyday Bwiti practice too, chewed before all-night drumming ceremonies to stay alert, closer to a stimulant use than a hallucinogenic one. The huge initiatory dose belongs to a different category entirely, reserved for one single passage in a person's life. James Fernandez, an anthropologist who spent the 1960s doing fieldwork among Bwiti practitioners in Gabon, described the initiation as an explicit death and rebirth structure. Practitioners describe the initiate as crossing into the land of the dead, meeting deceased ancestors and often Bwiti's own founding ancestors, before being led back to the world of the living by the officiating bonzi, initiated Bwiti practitioners who've made the same crossing themselves. Vincent Crapanzano, who did comparative fieldwork on Bwiti a decade later, recorded initiates describing the experience not as a hallucination they knew to be false, but a genuine visit, indistinguishable in memory from something that actually happened. Modern pharmacological research has confirmed ibogaine works through multiple neurotransmitter systems at once, producing an unusually long and unusually lucid altered state next to shorter-acting hallucinogens, which might explain why Bwiti initiates so consistently describe the encounter as memory instead of vision. The physical ordeal and the spiritual claim can't really be separated. An initiate who's taken enough iboga to risk cardiac arrest and lived has, by Bwiti logic, really gone to where the dead live and come back because the substance pushed their body close enough to the edge that the visit carries a weight a smaller dose couldn't provide. Fernandez recorded initiates being watched all night by Senior Bonzi, monitoring breathing and pulse, ready to step in, a setup that functioned as spiritual guidance and, in effect, emergency medical care centuries before either idea existed as its own category. Ibogaine is now being studied outside Gabon as a possible treatment for opioid addiction, with clinics in Mexico, Canada, and parts of Europe giving it to patients trying to break their dependency under medical supervision because the same cardiac risk the Bwiti built their whole initiation around is still fully present in a clinical setting. The route that once sent Gabonese initiates to meet their ancestors is now used to help addicted people meet a version of themselves that existed before the addiction took hold. Gabon made its initiates nearly die to reach the ancestors. In the Peruvian Andes, a different plant offered the entire civilization the same passage at a much lower price and built a temple specifically to deliver it. Number 3. San Pedro and the Oracle of Chavín de Huántar. Deep inside a stone temple in the Peruvian highlands sits a labyrinth of narrow passages, built specifically to disorient anyone walking through them in the dark. At the center stands a carved granite monolith over 4 meters tall, and etched into it is a fanged deity holding a cactus in its hand. Chavín de Huántar, an archaeological site in the north-central highlands of Peru, was a major ceremonial center between roughly 1200 and 500 BCE, predating the Inca by well over 1,000 years. The monolith at its center, known as the Lanzon, shows a deity clutching a ribbed columnar cactus that archaeologists identify as Echinopsis pachinoi, commonly called San Pedro, which contains mescaline, the same visionary alkaloid found in North America's peyote cactus. John Rick, a Stanford archaeologist who's led excavations at Chavín de Huántar since the 1990s, has mapped an internal architecture of narrow stone galleries, sound-amplifying ducts, and light shafts, all engineered to control exactly what a visitor could see, hear, and smell while moving through the complex in near-total darkness. Richard Berger, a Yale archaeologist who's published extensively on Chavín iconography and ritual, argues the site worked as an oracle center. Pilgrims traveling from across a wide swath of the central Andes went through a controlled sensory ordeal before drinking San Pedro and receiving a vision that a resident priesthood then interpreted. Iconography across the site consistently pairs the cactus with feline, serpent, and avian imagery, representing intermediary spirits believed capable of moving between the human world and the world of ancestors and gods. The mescaline in San Pedro produces vivid visual hallucinations and a strong sense of the boundary between self and environment dissolving, an effect that, delivered inside Chavín's engineered darkness and acoustics, would have arrived already primed by architecture built to strip away every ordinary sensory anchor. What actually convinced a pilgrim they'd reached the ancestors wasn't the temple by itself, not the carving, not the darkness. It was a bitter cactus drink, handed over at the exact moment their senses had nothing left to hold on to. Chavín's influence spread across much of the central Andes during its active centuries. Its iconographic style shows up on textiles, pottery, and stonework hundreds of kilometers from the temple itself, evidence that pilgrims carried the site's religious authority home with them after their ordeal. Rick's excavations also turned up dozens of ceramic snuff trays and bone tubes inside the galleries, suggesting San Pedro might have been paired with additional psychoactive plants prepared and given out by resident priests, rather than relied on alone. San Pedro is still used ceremonially across the Peruvian Andes today, and the passages beneath Chavín de Huántar are still open to visitors, who can walk the same dark route pilgrims walked 3,000 years ago to reach a god holding a cactus in one carved hand. Chavín used stone architecture to steer the mind toward the ancestors. In Greece, a different set of priests reached the same disorientation without tunnels, using a drink brewed once a year for the largest religious gathering in the ancient world.
Number 2. The kykeon of the Eleusinian mysteries. For nearly 2,000 years, tens of thousands of people traveled to a single site outside Athens, drank a barley-based beverage made by a hereditary priesthood, and came away describing something so overwhelming that ancient sources refused, uniformly, to describe what it actually was, on penalty of death. The Eleusinian mysteries, centered at the sanctuary of Eleusis, roughly 20 kilometers from Athens, ran continuously from at least the 7th century BCE until the sanctuary was destroyed in 392 CE. Drawing initiates that included Sophocles, Plato, Cicero, and the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, initiates fasted, then broke the fast with a drink called the kykeon, made from barley, water, and mint, according to the surviving Homeric hymn to Demeter, which lays out the myth behind the ritual. Demeter searching for her daughter Persephone after Hades took her to the underworld, and the goddess's eventual temporary reunion with her. Robert Wasson, Albert Hofmann, the chemist who first synthesized LSD in 1938, and classicist Carl Ruck co-wrote a 1978 book, The Road to Eleusis, arguing that barley grown on the Rarian plain near Eleusis could easily have carried Claviceps purpurea, the ergot fungus, which contains alkaloids chemically close to LSD and capable, prepared the right way, of producing genuinely visionary effects rather than just the poisoning ergot usually causes. Classicists still debate the idea, but it's backed up by how consistent the ancient testimony is. Across centuries, multiple independent writers describe the culminating night at Eleusis in strikingly similar terms: overwhelming light emerging out of total darkness, and the conviction, Cicero among others reported this, that they'd personally witnessed and no longer just believed in an afterlife. Cicero wrote that Athens had given nothing better to human life than the mysteries, crediting the experience with teaching people not only to live with more joy, but to die with better hope. The ritual reenacted Persephone's journey into and out of the underworld, and initiates seem to have experienced that journey as something closer to a personal event than a story being retold to them. Whatever was in the kykeon, its effect turned a myth about the dead into a memory initiates carried for the rest of their lives. Plato references the experience obliquely in the Phaedrus, describing initiates as having seen blessed sights and apparitions, language scholars have long read as less like philosophical metaphor and more like a man trying to describe something he'd actually witnessed and was sworn never to fully explain. The mysteries ended when the sanctuary was sacked, and the recipe for the kykeon, passed down orally by a hereditary priesthood for 1,000 years, ended right along with it. No written formula survives. The single largest shared religious experience of death and return in the ancient Mediterranean world now exists only in the descriptions left by people sworn never to fully describe it. Eleusis convinced an entire civilization's elite that death was survivable, using a drink whose exact recipe died with the priests who made it. In central Greece, a different oracle got to the same conviction, using something that needed no brewing at all. It simply rose straight up out of the ground. Number 1. The vapors of the Delphic Oracle. For over 1,000 years, the most powerful people in the ancient Mediterranean, kings, generals, entire city-states gearing up for war, traveled to a single crack in a mountainside in central Greece to ask a woman in a trance what the dead and the gods thought about their future.
For over a century, modern scholars insisted that crack and the vapors ancient writers described rising out of it had never existed at all. The Oracle at Delphi operated at the sanctuary of Apollo on the slopes of Mount Parnassus from at least the 8th century BCE until the sanctuary closed under Roman Christian rule in 393 CE. The Pythia, a priestess chosen from local women, sat on a tripod inside an inner chamber called the Aditon and delivered prophecies in a trance state that several ancient sources, including Plutarch, who served as a priest at Delphi himself in the 1st century CE, attributed to pneuma, a sweet-smelling vapor rising from a fissure in the chamber's floor. 20th century archaeologists who excavated the site found no fissure and no sign of any geological vent, and for most of that century, classicists dismissed the vapor theory as invented myth layered onto a woman's theatrical performance. Jelle de Boer, a geologist at Wesleyan University, surveyed the bedrock under Delphi in the 1990s and found 2 intersecting geological faults running directly beneath the sanctuary, a detail earlier excavators had missed because the fault lines don't produce a visible crack at the surface under normal conditions. De Boer, along with archaeologist John Hale of the University of Louisville and toxicologist Henry Spiller, published the findings in the journal Geology in 2001. Spring water samples from the site tested positive for ethylene and methane, gases that can seep up through fractured limestone in exactly the spot where the ancient temple stood. Ethylene at low concentrations produces a light floating euphoria and a trance-like detachment from ordinary awareness, a state early 20th century anesthesiologists documented firsthand before switching to safer anesthetic gases, describing patients under light ethylene sedation as detached, disoriented, and prone to vivid visions that felt personally significant. The Pythia herself was usually an older woman from the local community, chosen not for any particular gift, but for a life already lived, so that whatever the gas did to her over years of exposure carried less risk to the community than it would have for a young priestess with decades still ahead. Consultations happened on fixed days, roughly once a month during the 9 warmer months of the year, and demand regularly outpaced what one priestess could handle, leaving petitioners waiting, sometimes for months, for their turn in the chamber. Herodotus, Plutarch, and other ancient writers all describe petitioners going to the Pythia specifically to reach the dead, to learn how wars would turn out before they were fought, and to get guidance credited directly to Apollo speaking through her. Her answers were famously ambiguous, delivered in fragmented, riddling language that priests standing nearby would then interpret and turn into verse for the petitioner, a 2-step process that handed the institution enormous political influence for over 1,000 years, precisely because nobody outside the inner chamber could check what the vapor had really made her say. Croesus of Lydia, one of the wealthiest kings in the ancient world, consulted Delphi before invading Persia and was told that if he attacked, he'd destroy a great empire. He went to war and lost his own kingdom instead. The ambiguity of the prophecy fulfilled exactly the way ambiguity always allows, a story later Greek writers cited as proof of the oracle's power rather than its evasiveness. Right now, you're breathing air chemically related to what rose out of that Greek mountainside, a naturally occurring hydrocarbon gas seeping up through limestone, doing to a trained priestess's brain something a modern anesthesiologist would recognize instantly. The most consulted oracle in the ancient world, the voice kings crossed the Mediterranean to hear, turned out to be a geological accident, one that took 2 geologists, an archaeologist, and a fault line survey, and 23 centuries to finally explain.
10 substances, 10 cultures, separated by oceans and thousands of years, and every single one landed independently on the same conclusion, that the line between the living and the dead isn't fixed, it's just chemically thin. A child chewing coca on an Andean summit, a priestess breathing gas out of a Greek fissure, an initiate in Gabon brought right to the edge of cardiac arrest. None of them needed to agree on a god or a language to agree on a method. The plants and gases did the same thing to a human nervous system in Crete as they did in Guatemala,
because human neurochemistry doesn't stop to check which civilization it belongs to before it responds. Every one of these rituals eventually ended. The mysteries were sacked. The Pythias temple went silent. The Pax's dosage knowledge stopped passing down. But the compounds themselves outlasted every belief system built around them, and several are now back in laboratories, being tested again for pretty much the same reason people reach for them the first time. A hospital in Baltimore giving psilocybin to a dying patient isn't doing anything new. It's doing something a Maya priest and a Mazatec curandera were already doing, with less equipment and a lot more risk, long before anyone had a name for a controlled clinical trial. If you want to see more, click the video on screen.